we're going to have a talk to, luckily, we've got Heather Brunskell-Evans on here, who's the author of this book. And Heather Brunskell-Evans is a social theorist and philosopher. She's going to be talking about this book, Transgender Body Politics, which is published this week. Heather Brunskell-Evans is a spokesperson for Filia. She's a management committee member of Object, and she's co-author of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. And we have this book that she's written. So the first question I have for Heather is, what's the book about and why did you write it?
Firstly, I want to say that all the experiences and things that the other panelists have said was the motivation for writing the book. I think that the transgender movement is the patriarchy in flesh, as it were. It's the biggest threat to women's rights that we're facing at the moment. So I think that there is a connection between transgender ideology, prostitution, pornography, surrogacy, and so on and so forth. And I think the basis for this, the theoretical underpinning of all of this, is queer theory. So I wanted to explore the issue of queer theory, and I wanted to tie that back into the Women's Human Rights campaign, actually, because when I first was approached about the possibility of a women's human rights campaign, it was about identifying the material difference that substituting gender identity for sex would make across the board. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought it's really important to address this shift from sex to gender identity and get to the heart of it, because queer theory actually underpins the idea of prostitution as sex work. It underpins the idea that pornography is about sexual liberation, and it underpins the idea that two men can be the proper parents of a baby, and that the woman's body is an inconvenient object that they had to use for their parental rights. So getting back to transgenderism, it seems to me that transgenderism at the moment, or transgender ideology, is a way, more than any of the other issues I've talked about, of actually mobilizing the very queer theory that underpins all of it. So that was what I did. Now, the thing about queer theory, if I just look at my notes, the thing about queer theory is that what it wants to do is it wants to evacuate the body from all discussion, every single aspect of it. Because once you get rid of the body, then you can mobilize this idea that it's identity that matters. It's this nebulous, mythical identity. So why I wanted to write the book, I thought that what we've got to do is actually bring the body back in, make the body central. So I hope, I mean, other people will be the judge of this, whether I've done it sufficiently or well, is to bring the body, the woman's body, the child's body, the body politic, make connections between that and the way that the free speech, the ability to talk about this is suppressed or silenced. So that was the purpose of the book. And in doing so, what I wanted to do was draw attention to what will be thrown out if we substitute gender identity for sex. What will be thrown out is the knowledge that as women we belong to a sex class. Now, I know that makes a lot of women feel uncomfortable. They feel, well, I don't identify with that woman over there, and I don't identify with that woman over there. The point of the book is to demonstrate that whatever political position we come from, as women, we belong to a sex class. If we don't hold on to that idea, it's just an open door for the infringements of all of our spaces. It will affect everything, absolutely everything. So I thought I'd just give some pointers about what I mean about being a sex class. and the sex class being that we share a female body. So it's those of us who have given birth to babies, those of us who are same-sex attracted, those of us who have been sexually assaulted, those girls who have growing breasts. I know this was an experience of mine. I had a range of avuncular men in my life as a child, and then I discovered that when I started to grow breasts, men started to look at me quite differently. That was very disturbing. Those of us who know that women in prison, where they're invited to share their space with male-bodied human beings, many of those women have been sexually assaulted themselves. That, you know, the minute we change the language from women to cervix havers, that many, for that change that will occur in the UK in the National Health Service, for the tiniest minority of persons are affecting a change which will affect all women, many of whom don't actually understand themselves as being cervix holders or even know what a cervix actually is. So everything is becoming distorted by this. So substituting sex for gender identity deprives women as a class of understanding that they belong to a class, and turns it into an individualized identity, which we know then can utilize. It's very strange, actually, that people can't get this. So I just want to give you a little example of something. I gave a talk at a conference, and it was actually a Quaker conference where everybody's terribly nice and wants to love everybody else, which is great. I'm all for that. And I was seen as somebody who wanted to hurt poor, vulnerable trans people, trans men who identify as women. And the idea that women was a sex class was it just fell completely on deaf ears. There was no understanding amongst the women that this was the case. And then a strange thing happened. A woman came up to me afterwards, and she told me how unfair I was being and mean to what she would call trans women, what she called trans women. And I said to her, it was at the end of the conference, and I was trying very hard to make connections with her. And I asked her how she was getting home that night. Was she going back on, I was staying at the conference centre, was she going back by public transport? And she's absolutely horrified. No, she couldn't possibly go on public transport, because it was Birmingham, a city in the UK, and she would be very afraid to go on public transport. And she had made no connection whatsoever with that was the very fact that I'd been talking about. This isn't an assault on any particular man who wants to identify as trans as being inherently aggressive. It is about belonging to a sex class where men, whether they want to identify as trans or not, are a threat to women. So that hopefully there is something in my book for whoever wants to read it, which will draw out those connections. Terrible irony of this is, whilst we can't talk about our bodies, we're silenced from talking about our bodies. This is transphobic, bigoted, and so on and so forth. What actually happens is, if we don't bring the body back in, we give the space for men that men who identify as women are the only people given permission to talk about women's bodies anymore. So, for example, Bruce Jenner, who fathered children, was an Olympic athlete, can talk about what it's like to be a woman, but all of us in that category that I've just talked about, with all our different experiences of being female bodies, can't. And this is clearly so authoritarian, and a men's rights movement writ large we have to resist it. And what I do talk about in the book also is the way that this is funded. This is a heavily funded movement. It's not just a grassroots movement of growing up from the bottom. It's being manipulated from top down as well. So there are many areas to discuss, and I hope that the book has done that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Heather. So that's this is the book here. So you can get this from Spinifex Press. So Heather, how is this book different from your excellent last book, The Invention of the Transgender Child, which came out a couple of years ago? In what ways will we know more by reading this book?
What actually happens when we talk about transgenderism, that often people don't make the connection between the medicalization of children and men entering women's sports, for example. In the popular imagination, these are separate issues. So as I've said, I wanted to make the connection between those. Now, in particular with children, what I wanted to do, what I did in the other book, hopefully, is that I explored some of the ways in which the Tavistock, which is the clinic in the UK, which the National Health Service of the UK, which is responsible for medicalizing children, in order to allegedly change their sex. Or I did touch on queer theory, but I didn't explore it in great depth, and I wanted to do that in this book. I wanted to really explore that, because what happens, in the popular imaginations, doctors have some sort of magical knowledge. They're objective in some sense. They can be trusted, and I wanted to explain the way that queer theory absolutely underpins the work that goes on at the Tavistock. It's quite shocking. But it's there, and I documented the ways that clinicians at the Tavistock talk about gender identity, not sex. They forefront gender identity, and of course there are a range of clinicians at the Tavistock who will emphasize it more or less. But on the whole, my argument in the book is that the Tavistock has been captured by queer theory, and the consequences for children are catastrophic. I don't need to go into that here, but the consequences are catastrophic, and this needs to be understood by people. At the moment, there will be, in 2 or 3 days' time in the UK, a challenge to the Tavistock and the practice of medicalizing children, and it's frustrating for me. I'm delighted that the challenge is being made. But the frustration that I will have in that challenge is that what will be discussed are things like whether the drugs have been licensed or not, what kinds of effects the drugs will have on children's bodies, whether children can consent or whether they can't consent, whether there has been enough therapy for disturbed children who, majority of whom are girls at the moment, who seek support from the Tavistock. All of these things are absolutely very important. They're central to it. But what doesn't get discussed is the ideology that has underpinned all of those important things. All of those things are founded on something, and that is the ideology. So we need to, wherever we can, point out that the Tavistock is not neutral, has never been neutral, and it's not neutral because it substitutes gender identity for biological sex. So that's the emphasis from this last book that I think I've developed more from the previous book. So it's taking the themes from the previous book and exploring them even more within the context that you can't separate out what happens to medicalizing children from a society which accepts that men can compete in women's sports. They're connected, and I hope that people will eventually begin to see some of the connections between those, because we often talk about them in different silos, as it were.
You missed out one of the very important points, I think, Heather. This book is about a third of the cost of the last book. and it is a lot cheaper. I've just looked online, and it looks as if you can get it in the UK from between about £6 and £9 or £10, and that makes it more accessible immediately to women who would like to get it, and it's also available on Kindle and various other methods. Apart from it being very good and having other issues,
I have gone through a whole process from having edited that book with my co-editor, Professor Michelle Moore, and also having written in it myself. I've been myself on a journey in relation to publishing. At that time, it was very difficult to get anything published which was in any way critical of transgenderism. And we were fortunate to get a publisher who would do it. And actually, if you read the latest book by Spinifex, you will discover that, you know, that book, the expensive book on the invention of the transgender child, there was an attempt to even stop that book being published by the Tavistock. So the story about that is there. I would like to return to Spinifex and say that I think this book will be obviously much more available to everybody. And I want to put a word in for Spinifex, who, contrary to the previous publishers, who I know were frightened themselves. They were frightened because they were frightened of legal action too from the Tavistock, have been a great publisher to work with, because I did a classic mistake with this book, I think, and it comes from my training. I wrote about queer theory, its effect on, you know, women's bodies, children's bodies, the body politic, and so on. But I tried to keep myself out of it because my training although I know that the personal is political, I thought it would be best if I kept my own experience out of it. And Spinifex kept writing back and saying, that's great, but put yourself in there. It's those stories that will bring it to life for people. So it's because of Spinifex that those experiences, my experiences, are now embedded within the book. So I hope that it will be a lively read for people as well.
Quite a lot of women here are newish to radical feminism, and Spinifex Press have a back copies of lots and lots of really good radical feminist books. So if you're looking for a load of books that you could read that are well edited, and some of them back as far as 1974, there's some really good stuff. It's definitely worth looking at Spinifex. So another question I have for you, Heather, is this. There have been momentous government statements in the UK and court decisions in the UK in the last couple of weeks that make your book even more important. Can you tell us what you think the implications of the news in the UK the implications are of these bits of news in the UK?
It's been stunning, absolutely stunning. I don't know whether people are aware of what's gone on in the UK. If I just explain simply that what has actually happened is the reform of the Gender Recognition Act in this country, which was going to be reformed, and like the other panelists have said, it was just going to go through quite quietly. The reform is going to be that men who identified with women, of course women who identified with men, but it's the men who identified with women that is the problem for us, could sign a piece of paper and change their birth certificate so it would appear that they were, for all intents and purposes, they were actually born female. So what actually happened, I tried to explain this quite briefly, what actually happened was that once women got an understanding of the consequences of this, or got their head around it, we have mobilized. From a grassroots level, we have mobilized. It has been quite stunning, and there are many women who've done this, to whom I am indebted. And if I'd like to put in a plug here for a Women's Place UK, which I think have been, amongst others, like Fair Play for Women, who have been very instrumental in this. So what it demonstrates is the way that, and so that law now will not be reformed. It's unbelievable. It is just a great coup. So what we learn from this is that mobilizing from a grassroots level can be effective if you join together and hold hands. This is what is needed. Now, we can't rest on our laurels because there is, this is just one aspect of it. I would like to say the ways in which I'm very worried about. Apparently there is. The Tavistock is being reviewed at the moment because we've made so much fuss, and I'd like to, with Michelle Moore, take a little bit of credit for this, that there is a way that the Tavistock has been put under a spotlight for the medicalization of transing children. And a neutral, independent review apparently is going to happen. Was announced, I think it was on exactly the same day as we learned that the Gender Recognition Act isn't going to be reformed. And I went to bed that night. I didn't open a bottle of champagne. I wanted to, but I was so damned exhausted. I felt like I'd just come to the end of a marathon with the Gender Recognition Act. And I woke up in the morning worried about the independent review. And I did a little bit of exploration and realized that already it's very worrying that that review won't be independent because of the kinds of people they got to endorse the alleged independence of it. So we can't stop. We have to be completely vigilant, going forward with this. It would be very easy, I think, to think, we have this gain now, we can stop, because it is exhausting. It is exhausting, but we have to move. And I think move forward. And I think the key thing is that the transgender empire, and it has felt like an empire that's well-funded, has lobbies like, Stonewall and children's trans lobby groups like Mermaid and Gender Intelligence. They've had so much sway, including over medicine, shocking, that it felt like the empire was unassailable. Well, we've demonstrated that it's not, and I think it needs to be taken apart brick by brick. I intend to carry on hopefully with other women doing that, and I would like to also talk about the Women's Human Rights Campaign, because I think it's one of the most important organizations that has happened in relation to all of this substitution of gender identity for sex. And when Joe initially mooted it, I thought it was way beyond, before people started to begin to understand the consequences of it, that it was essential. I think it's what is so important is that not only in the UK, where we have been effective, but that we join hands globally about this, because it's spreading. It's like a pandemic. It is spreading. And the only way to prevent the spread of it is to forcefully resist it, absolutely resist it. And before, I probably talked quite a long time now. I've lost track of the time, and it's we probably have to come to an end.
Yeah, so I think if we just give you one more minute, and then we're going to go back to panel view and round up.
Okay.
Implications of what you've said. So one more minute, and that's
okay. Great. So what I'd like to just end on is something that has slightly troubled me. That it's very easy to think, I won't associate with that group because they have a different politics to me. I won't associate with those people over there because they have a different politics about something else. I think, as Alison Bailey, I don't know whether people not in the UK know anything about Alison Bailey, but Alison Bailey is a barrister who has her attempting to a legal case at the moment against Stonewall. And Alison Bailey said this is the biggest fight that she understands that women have faced in the last few years. I completely and absolutely agree with her. And now what she says is, let us iron out our differences. When this is the major battle, we have a major battle here. Time enough will come when we can talk about and discuss the differences that we have with people. But let's join hands at the moment and fight this battle full on, full frontal.